Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going over some additional advanced tips for the game of War Thunder. While the last one focused a lot more on the macro, this is going to be focusing more on the micro, the little things you can do to make your gameplay slightly better. And since it is the holidays, let's start off with a slightly festive tip. The snow isn't actually real. Or more accurately, when you start running onto maps that have snow-covered banks or even sand dunes, the top section that would theoretically just be some very soft-packed snow or sand, you can actually shoot shells straight through them. They basically don't have a hitbox. So if you are on one of these maps, you can kind of use your binoculars to aim over these obstacles and shoot shells through the very top of them without any real problems. Obviously, once you start getting on harder terrain like rocks, concrete, etc., the entire area that you see will basically be the hitbox most of the time, so that's not really viable, but it is a helpful tip on these specific maps. Speaking of binoculars, this is actually a good tip. When the game tells you to use your binoculars, it's free. The game is not actually wrong. This is a pretty good idea to use your binoculars, and if you have a particularly low velocity gun, you can use your binoculars to fire at targets that you can't actually see. The way you do this indirect fire is you essentially take the binoculars, you range find through the binoculars, this will give you a pretty accurate distance, and then you hit the fire button, which should put your gun exactly where your binoculars are pointing, and at that point you can either manually set the sight distance control or just aim slightly up. Either way, whatever is easiest for you, and you can shoot at targets you can't see. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually not that difficult. However, you do generally need a gun with a low velocity, or you need to be on such a big map that the higher velocity shells will have enough time to drop. So it is kind of a situational tactic, but it is very satisfying when you can pull it off. This brings up another fun little tip. You can actually laze targets through the binoculars. What I mean by that is, if you have a vehicle with a laser rangefinder attachment and you pull the binoculars up and rangefind, it will actually laze them, and thus it will also set the distance for your weapon. So you can obviously use this if you're about to crest a hill to go ahead and have this elevation set on your laser rangefinder. Now, this feature doesn't really make any sense because your commander is basically yanking the laser rangefinder from outside of the tank and duct taping them to the binoculars and lasing from there, but so this might actually be removed from the game at some point, but currently it is how it works. And this also brings up a valid point that if you're using the Vidar has a laser rangefinder and fires a relatively low velocity shell. You can use the binoculars to spot targets, laze them, get the proper range, that way you don't even have to worry about setting sight distance controls and fire at them, which is probably why the Vidar shouldn't be at its current battle rating, but it is what it is. In keeping with a lot of the talk about laser rangefinders, rangefinding, whatever, another big tip is if you're watching an angle and you feel like you're going to be there for a while, or you're pretty familiar with the map and you know people are going to be coming into your field of fire, a good idea is just to go ahead and pre-range the area. If you have a laser rangefinder, you can go ahead and set your laze to whatever you need, because some people do have laser warning systems that will let them know when you're lasing them. So go ahead and get your laze early, that way you already have the range and they won't get that advanced warning, is always nice. Or just go ahead and range find the area so that you're pretty confident that you can hit enemies once they appear. Which also brings us to another neat tip. Since you can always see the distance to a capture point, if an enemy is on a capture point, you always know the range to them. It's basically a free range find that you get at all times, so you should definitely be taking advantage of that. You ideally want to speak the language of the vehicle crews that you are using, because it turns out your crew members, whenever you range find specifically on a vehicle, will actually call out the range before it's done range finding, so that's always nice. And of course, one final tip, if you have a laser rangefinder and your vehicle has a very high velocity round like darts that you'll often find at top tier, a good idea is just to go ahead and range find something 200 or 300 meters out right at the beginning of the map, because this will basically set up your point blank to engage almost anything just by clicking on the middle of it throughout the entire map. A lot of the top tier maps and maps in general, you're not going to be engaging targets more than like 600 to 700 meters away, and in a 600 to 700 meter engagement, if your range is already set to 300 because of how little these high velocity rounds move up or down, you can actually just kind of click on the middle of where you want and it will mostly hit where you need at basically any combat range. So that's just a little thing you can do to help make your shots land more accurately, more quickly, without necessarily having to range find every individual opponent. Now, one situation that vehicles commonly find themselves in and that really kind of defines better or worse players is actually the corner. It turns out if you're on a corner, it's actually a slightly more complicated engagement than a lot of other encounters. So if you are on a corner and you know either through audio or because they've been scouted or whatever that somebody else is just around the other side of the corner and they're coming towards it, the big thing you should do is you should back off of that corner. There are two main reasons why. Number one is what's called barrel awareness. You need to know where your barrel is basically at all times, because the last thing you want is to have your barrel sticking slightly too far out and have the other person just shoot it off and not be able to attack them. At that point, you're basically the freest kill in the world for that person. The other thing is, the distance an enemy moves on your screen is relative to how far away you are from them. Or to put that in simpler terms, if you're 1 meter away and somebody moves 10 meters in front of you, they basically flash across your entire screen. If you're 1,000 meters away and they move 10 meters in front of you, they basically just didn't move at all. So you want to be further back so that you have more time to line up the target, and so that if they just rush around the corner, you're not like trying to shift your whole tank and turret to meet them. Instead, you only have to make a slight adjustment. Now, this also brings up another challenge, is like, if you know somebody's around a corner, how do you try to go towards that encounter? There are actually a few different strategies for it, and it kind of depends on the vehicle that you're using and the vehicle the enemy is using. A very basic tactic for approaching a corner, if you know you have pretty good frontal armor, is to back up a little off of the corner and approach it at an angle. That way, the very first part of your vehicle you're presenting is a heavily angled front of your vehicle. This is a lot harder for the enemy to engage, obviously, because they won't necessarily be able to see your sides around the corner, and your front is heavily angled. Another potential solution is what's called reverse side scraping, where you go up to the corner and then you back off of it at a sharp angle. This is more useful if you aren't very confident in your armor, because the heavily angled side is often difficult to hit, and a lot of times all they'll do is disable your track, and you can still spin the vehicle around on that one track. So this kind of reverse side scraping tactic is pretty useful if you have like moderate armor but you're not super confident in it, because the angle you're presenting to the enemy is often so steep that they won't be able to pen it, even if they could normally go straight through the front of your tank. The final tactic, and this is basically just for vehicles that are incredibly fast and have no armor, is just to blaze around the corner as fast as possible. If you get some of the higher BR wheeled vehicles, like a lot of the 8x8s, like the Centauro, the Striker, etc., what you'll find is that your vehicle can't take a hit from any angle, and your vehicle is actually pretty vulnerable to getting knocked out, especially by things like high explosive HESH, guided missiles, whatever. So what you want to do with these vehicles is you want to get a running start and go around the corner as fast as possible, presenting a full broadside. This does raise an interesting point, because these vehicles have so little armor and they have such a large internal volume that you want to present your opponent the biggest target possible for them to miss critical components. Which seems counterintuitive, especially if you're used to like World War II style vehicles that have APHE rounds, but because these like big light vehicles don't necessarily fuse rounds correctly or don't create a lot of shrapnel, you can just fly around the corner full broadside and hope they don't hit anything important, and it does kind of work, although it's not a tactic you really want to push if you have a better option. And this doesn't really neatly segue, but it does bring us to another common problem that new players do, is if you know you're about to get shot, you need to move. Not necessarily move away from the enemy, sometimes moving towards them is just as viable, but what you really want to do is you want to make their shot as difficult as possible. You want to force them to keep aiming and increase the likelihood that they will either bounce or hit non-critical components. So moving directly towards or away from your opponent is usually not the best option, because at that point you're not changing your armor profile and you're not changing where they have to aim, you're just making it slightly bigger or slightly smaller. You want to try to move laterally, but not so far that you're exposing a really weak side, which is, it's a bit tricky, but you will get the hang of it if you try it often enough. And you also kind of want to move your turret back and forth. Again, much like with the barrel awareness, if it doesn't matter if you make your hull immune to damage if you're just giving them a free barrel shot and then they can just pick you apart at leisure. So moving your turret, moving your hull, moving towards them at an angle, all of these tactics are viable. If you have smoke and you whiff your shot, just pop smoke. All of these things can potentially work. And really what you need to do if you have just whiffed your shot or you know you're about to get shot at, is do literally anything other than nothing. Doing nothing dramatically increases the likelihood that you will get taken out, whereas moving very rarely hurts you. Now, one thing that I do notice with War Thunder is that while a lot of people will obsess with frontal armor profiles and exactly where to aim with what guns, It turns out the biggest thing that a lot of new players especially get wrong is actually the easy kills, the things you should be able to get done very easily. And so to briefly go through places that you can often shoot on enemies basically regardless of battle rating, if you see an enemy tank, the best place to shoot it 9 times out of 10 from the side is going to be to draw a line at the middle of the turret and then shoot directly below where the turret meets the hull on that line. This area 9 times out of 10 will knock out a tank. If you're at World War II battle ratings, you usually have an armor-piercing high explosive or APAG, so putting the round here will often take out both all of the turret crew and usually the driver and radio operator as well. If you go into more modern tanks, yes, you have more narrow spalling patterns, but also more modern tanks tend to only have 2 or 3 turret crew, so it's actually a lot easier to knock them out, and there's only 1 crew member in the hull, so you don't have to worry about knocking them out. So usually from the side, you just draw a line in the middle of the turret, then go down below where the turret meets the hull and put a round in there. If you're shooting a target from the back, typically the best way to shoot it is actually the back of the turret, not the back of the hull. The back of the hull will disable the engine, and if they have a particularly slow turret traverse or no turret at all, this can still be useful. But back of the turret tends to disable or take enemies out a lot more often, almost regardless of battle rating. So with these 2 shots in these 2 places, you can more consistently basically knock out enemies that are not aware of you, and if you can successfully knock out enemies that are not aware of you, that means you stand a better chance of getting to the enemies who are aware of you and trying to figure out that puzzle as well. And as one final tip, and something that was added in the very last update, when your teammate shoots an enemy and they do some level of damage, it will mark them on your minimap with the same arrows, kind of the scouting. However, if they destroy them as of the last update, instead of just marking them, it will actually show a cool little skull. So this lets you know that that target is no longer a threat and you don't need to worry about it. And I actually think this is a really cool addition to the game, and I'm actually pretty happy they added it. So yeah, make sure to pay attention to the skulls, that way you know when certain enemies have been dealt with and when you can move on to other targets. And that concludes our video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That really helps out the channel. Have a great day, everybody.